Hi and welcome to Boston Media Theory. I'm Marcus Breen and we're here to talk, as we have done in the past, with people who live and work in Boston who are researchers, academics, consultants, activists, people who are engaged in looking at media and communication and culture and that sort of interdisciplinary field, who are working in I guess, the sense of making sense of it. And I'm delighted today to welcome Kevin Carragee, who's from Suffolk University. And Kevin is a specialist. I think that's the word. We use that word, Kevin? Specialist?
I'll let you use it.
Okay, specialist in social movements. And I think we're at a moment in history where social movements are at a really profoundly important level for the way that they're informing social life and redefining politics and connecting with media, which is certainly true with anything that's based in the digital environment, particularly social media. So there's a lot we can talk about. So welcome, Kevin.
I'm happy
Thanks
to
for
be
being
here.
here.
Thank you.
Great. And I just wanted to get an understanding first of, the sort of extent to which you've seen social movements change over the many years you've been exploring them and researching on that field.
Yeah, it strikes me that one of the things that drew me to the field, that if you look at U.S. history, that fundamental change, in my view of many others, fundamental change in the United States has always been a product of social movement mobilization. If you think about movements as varied as the suffragette movement, women's movement of the 60s and 70s, anti-Vietnam War movement, abolitionist movement, the temperance movement too. So it strikes me that social movements have always been an engine in the United States for social and political change, significant social and political change. We lived in a different political and mediated environment now, so the nature of social movement mobilization, the nature of how social movements advance their ideas, that's been transformed over the last particularly 10 years through digital media. At the same time, certain other things have remained consistent. So I'm interested in the consistencies and the discontinuities between the past and the present in terms of politics, movements, and media.
Right. Let me just back up a little and say that you work in a communication program, communication studies. Where does social movements fit in that field? And why would it be there rather than, let's say, something like history or sociology or, I don't know, somewhere else?
Right. I think it's clearly an interdisciplinary area, meaning the study of social movements. Political scientists contribute to the literature. Sociologists, of course, do, and some anthropologists. Some people in communication, some people in journalism on a communication and journalism department. So there's a robust literature in communication and journalism on social movements, particularly, not surprisingly, on the interaction between social movements and the news media.
Okay.
And that's been a long time specialization of mine.
Okay, so would you say that the importance of understanding the influence of news media on public mobilization is central to understanding social movements, at least from your perspective?
Yeah, I think, historically, one looks at social movements want to mobilize people, they want to advance their ideas. And they also want to reach people who need to be convinced that certain changes are necessary. I'm interested in progressive movements that fight for social justice. So they want to mobilize people to their cause. A traditional way to reach people beyond your base is to try to influence the news media that you're newsworthy. That's obstacle number one. Obstacle number two is to try to influence that coverage in ways that are consistent or harmonious to your goals. And so I'm interested in the interaction between journalists and activists, and that's often a very difficult terrain for activists.
And I suppose you have to also work out where the initial energy for the movement has to come from. I mean, I think generally speaking, there's a consensus that there's a grievance. The grievance
Sure.
has to be pretty generalized. Is that right?
I think that's right. I think grievances alone don't predict social movement mobilization, but grievances linked to the ability to organize successfully, to have certain resources to organize, that can lead to a mobilization of the movement. I think one of the continuities between the present and the past is that progressive social movements always find themselves an imbalanced power relationship. That is, if one looks at traditional American journalism over a long period of time, there's much research on this. American journalism traditionally been heavily influenced by political elites, often elites that do not want to support significant social and political change.
Surprise, surprise.
Surprise.
Yeah.
One thinks about the labor movement in the United States, for example, at the 20s and 1930s into the 40s. And therefore, social movements have very difficult time, progressive social movements, attracting news coverage and influencing that news coverage in ways that's consistent with their aims. And there's a long tradition of research, which I know you're aware of, where American mainstream news organizations, and we should say that corporate news media, often delegitimize, denigrate progressive movements of different types, and as a result really become they don't enhance the ability of the movement to mobilize, they in fact impair it.
And that's what they set out to do, one would imagine.
I think that's at least, especially because of the sourcing patterns traditionally in American journalism, that the most newsworthy are people who have power, and therefore they dominate the symbolic universe of news coverage. Makes it hard for people who, and we're often dealing with disenfranchised groups and communities who lack power, to break through those kind of news barriers.
Interesting, because I was just thinking while you were talking, this is am I right in suggesting or thinking that this is a somewhat unique American formation, the social movements that you're interested in? And the reason I ask that is because growing up in Australia, I grew up with a different political formation, namely the Labor Party. And like the British Labor Party and social democratic parties in Western Europe, they not only had a connection to left movements and socialism and in some cases communism, but they had a connection that meant that they were organised through labour trade unions, became a political party, and then sought parliamentary representation. Very different formation, isn't it?
Yeah, I think one has to talk about, researchers talk about American exceptionalism, the absence of a consistent left-wing party in the United States, and there are historical reasons for that, and there's also reasons tied to repression of, for example, the Red Scare, early 20th century, pre and post World War I, which really ruined the Socialist Party, which was trying to mobilize in the United States. And then, of course, the Cold War period, where left ideas were delegitimized. And you really have an absence of those kind of social we don't have a social democratic party. We never had one.
No, right.
That's robust.
Yeah.
And the Democratic Party has been as far left in terms of a mainstream party, but it's been often a coalition. I mean, much of its history in the 20th century, kind of uneasy coalition between northern liberals and southern racist conservatives.
Yeah, right. Where does the kind of connection between what we might think of as public relations and its use of media coming from social movements then help to mobilise? I'm thinking about the sort of way that conventional models of media or media coverage in the press have collapsed and fallen apart, partly through public relations, the emergence of public relations, corporate and otherwise. And public relations, it's been used by people on the left or by people who want to bring about change. We can talk about social media and new media later, but I'm just wanted to explore that.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of, again, it's a complex story. On one level, traditional public relations, mainstream public relations, dominated by corporate interests. And therefore, the public relations industry as a whole very much reinforces existing inequalities, existing structural problems within the society, it strikes me. It is true that there are activists and there have been social movements that have been historically, you look into the past, very skilled at courting news coverage and very skilled at trying to influence that news coverage. And I mean, the classic example here is the civil rights movement, the African American civil rights movement. King was very skilled at, along with his associates, along with the movement itself, drawing news coverage, his skillful use of civil disobedience, the ability to attract news coverage, peaceful demonstrators being, obviously, violently attacked. Well, that didn't play well, for lots of Americans watching on their television screens, reading their newspapers, and as a result, it made people more sympathetic, at least some people, more sympathetic to the social movement's aims. So you have, I think, a history of activists. It's not easy, with the ability, I wouldn't link it necessarily to public relations, but I would link it to kind of a skilled advocacy to try to court and influence news coverage of their cause.
Does it fit somewhere between, social movement theory, if you like, fits somewhere between a sort of status quoism within a sort of working model, an evolutionary working model of democracy, and kind of more of a revolutionary movement? Is it somewhere located somewhere within that?
I think that's fair to say. I think that's fair to say.
What happens when, within social movements, it does sort of flow over to something that's more violent? What's the response?
Well, I think that's an issue, the degree to which certain social movements are willing to use violent means to attract attention, to advance their causes. I mean, the United States obviously is born of revolutionary politics in certain ways. I think at the same time, a movement that uses violence faces often more government repression, and violence can, of course, make people less sympathetic. My own view of activism is of a view of skillful use of multiple tactics, including civil disobedience. Often in democratic societies can be more useful than advocating for or using violence to advance your cause. So
I guess we have to get to one of the key questions that I always am forced to ponder when I think about social movements, and that is, how do we address what seems to be this very strange idea of democracy in the United States? When I say the idea of democracy, it is so ill-defined. It is such a work in progress. And I'm wondering what kind of contribution social movement theory makes to those sorts of important discussions.
It strikes me that one of the principal ways progressive social movements advance their arguments is that they contrast the ideals of American society, which are, I fully embrace, with the actual practice of American democracy. So one can look at the degree to which the United States doesn't live up to its own principles. Practicing U.S. democracy falls far short than the hopes of American democracy. And that can be used as an indication of hypocrisy, and that can be used as an indication that now we have a deeply flawed democracy dominated by corporate interests. I mean, this was a kind of trope, right? A repeated argument of Occupy. And it was an argument that many Americans accepted, believed, and were waiting for a movement to try to articulate that. And certainly, when people say, well, Occupy didn't have much influence, I would read it quite differently. The fact that there's much discussion of income inequality in the United States today, and certain measures at least being discussed to try to address it, the fight for 15, for example, states moving to a $15 minimum wage. That strikes me as an outgrowth of Occupy, and I'd also point out, the Democratic Party's moved, at least part of it, moved further to the left. I think that's a product of Occupy. And I've interacted with many Occupy activists who are now active in all sorts of local grassroots mobilizations. So it's not as if the spirit of it disappeared. It strikes me that we won't know the long-term consequences of Occupy for quite some time.
Quite some time, and I suppose it also will manifest itself in lots of different ways. If you think of it from a postmodern perspective, that there will be many different ways of thinking about what a social movement, how a social movement translates itself into the sort of material conditions that people might be.
I've always been struck by a Chinese government official being interviewed in the 1960s, was asked about the consequences of the French Revolution, and he said it was too early to tell.
Yeah.
So it's an example.
Do we have to wait that long? I mean, I'm not talking about the consequences of the French Revolution in France, but I'm talking about, you know, what we might see happening in the United States. When we recognise the importance of media and the way it influences public opinion, let's say, what happens with the alternative media? People who study media and communication often place a great deal of emphasis and even enthusiasm on alternative media, but a lot of that has died out. Local news papers, the alternative magazines, or things that used to be on street corners. What's happening with alternative media now, do you think?
I mean, I think there's a mixed picture here. I think on one level, you're right to say one can look in the past historically again, and you can talk about, for example, the black press playing an enormously important role throughout U.S. history in terms of advocacy for African American causes and justice for African Americans, equality for African Americans. Can talk about the alternative press in the 60s and 70s fueling the environmental movement, fueling the anti-war movement, feminist magazines, feminist newspapers, all having a role. And you know, I think they continue to have a role. I think one thing we haven't talked about, which one of your questions implied, and now there's a different landscape, of course, and that landscape's digital.
Sure.
Digital media. And I think that's a different terrain. There's certain continuities in the past in terms of movements and how they operate, and there's certain discontinuities. And I think the presence of digital media does change the political landscape, does change the media landscape for movements, but I think in complex ways. And one thing I'm totally opposed to is that you know, one talks about, I think this is really sloppy analytically, you know, Twitter revolutions or a Facebook revolution. I mean, that's foolish. You know, the technologies by themselves don't, on their own, lead to successful or even failed mobilizations. It's a question of using them in purposive ways so that they lead to mobilization for progressive movements.
Well, on the other side of that ledger, of course, is the remarkable success of Donald Trump with his use of Twitter.
Indeed.
I call this a negative social movement because it seems to me that the notion of a social movement is inevitably, unless you can correct me, but it's inevitably progressive. When people refer to social movements, it assumes some sort of collective action claiming, which has agency to claim some sort of progress or some sort of improvement in the social and economic conditions, generally speaking. But with Trump, it seems that a lot of the conditions associated with what he's been able to do with his mobilisation, or the mobilisation of quite reactionary ideas, is supported by a very large number of people, maybe 30, 40 million Americans, and he feeds that incredible more, demanding, you know, the mouth just demanding more and more, and he just keeps stuffing stuff into it through Twitter.
Yeah, and I think the broad picture is, just as progressive movements can use digital media to mobilize and advance their causes, reactionary politicians can use the same digital tools for repressive aims, for what we would say would be, you know, to advance social injustice rather than social justice. And one can look at the use of digital media by reactionary movements in Europe, in the United States, neo-fascists in Europe, neo-fascists in the United States, the Tea Party in the United States successfully using digital media to some extent. I think one of the problems in contemporary scholarship in social movements, given the political sympathies of many academics, not all, but many, they tend to study left of center progressive movements, and we should pay more attention to the National Front in France, for example, the Five Star movement in Italy, for example. So there's many examples today, sadly, of, I would say, movements that would in fact advance social injustice, not social justice. So I think that's one of the weaknesses in the literature.
I suppose that means that we have to recognise that the tools around social movements, the media tools, are open to everybody, and that we're in a increasingly complex environment.
Including open, of course, to corporate power and those traditional elites who've been able to communicate effectively through many means over many, not decades, but centuries. This is a powerful tool for them to advance their ideas, to advance their views. So one thinks about, for example, the charter school, quote unquote, movement in the United States, which I find appalling. It's really the privatization of public education. But they've successfully used public relations, they've successfully used corporate funding, conservative foundation funding, digital media to advance what I would say is an assault on public education. And public education is central to civic education, central to democracy itself.
I'm wondering where, in the general scheme of things, and I'm looking at some of the books you've been involved in editing, Communication Activism. Was that Volume 1? And we skipped Volume 2. I don't know what happened to Volume 3. So Volume 1 and 3, we're looking for Volume 2. Folk, you can get that in your local library.
I knew you only had 2 hands, so I was remembering 3 volumes.
Where do we go in this literature, theoretically?
I think the key thing here, and I know you're aware of this, traditionally scholars, researchers, academics, they've studied movements, they've explained movements, they've studied the interaction between movements and the news media. What they haven't done is form partnerships with disenfranchised groups, disenfranchised communities. I'm talking now a partnership between a researcher and these groups, where the researcher is no longer simply studying, but the researcher is acting in partnership with the groups to advance causes linked to social justice. So now you have a kind of threefold process. The researcher still describes and explains the group, the movement, but also he or she, the researcher, reflects on his or her intervention with the group, all right? Because we have certain skills, academics, in terms of our knowledge that can be of use to social movements, that can be used to marginalized groups and communities. So for example, I have some skills in terms of framing public arguments and framing arguments to the news media. Well, that can be quite useful for social movement groups.
Speaking of social movement groups, you've been a long-term member of the MRAP, Media Research
and Action Project.
Of which I'm a member and a participant. And I was thinking when you were talking then about this sort of connection of, if you like, a research method or a social research method of our colleague Charlotte Ryan, who is engaged in a lot of projects over many years as a member of MRAP, along with our colleague Bill Gamson, who we've interviewed here. In fact, I've interviewed all the MRAP members, active members on this program. But the point is to think about what sort of contribution researchers can make to the community. And certainly Charlotte would be one of the examples of somebody who's done exemplary work with homeless people in Rhode Island, for example, helping them organise. And it seems to me that it's not a highly complicated set of actions. It's a set of actions which is not to denigrate it, but it's a set of actions that we often don't think about. That the skills that we have are simple communicative skills. How do you know who to call in a news organisation? How do you know how to write a press release? That sort of thing seems to me to be also part of the fabric of how research can contribute to social movements.
I agree, and I think often researchers also possess skills linked to persuasion or skills in terms of digital media designing an attractive website, for example, effectively using Twitter, for example. So I think you can bring those things to the skills, to the group, or to the social movement. But I would, one thing, and I know Charlotte Ryan and Bill Gamson, yourself, and I agree with this, don't denigrate in doing this. Activists have skills too. They have knowledge. And I think it's very important to work in a collaborative way with activists and with community groups, to recognize the lay knowledge they have, to recognize that they know their grievances. And as you know, working with activists, they also know quite often how to dramatically articulate them. So I think it's really important to respect the knowledge of activists, to respect the knowledge of community groups, to provide counsel, yes, to try to enhance, yes, but it should not be, and I think this is really important, it's not a top-down model where the academic comes to the group bearing gifts. That's not my vision of what it should be.
the cargo cult or something.
Exactly.
And I'm thinking, just as we wrap up, what's your impression of the sort of more the shift in activism or interest in activism from the younger generation, students who you see a lot of, and everything from the new Green Deal to Sunrise Movement, I think it's called, or other sorts of movements where younger people connecting with new media forms seem to offer a whole new range of social movement options. Is that
I think that's a fair assessment. I think, my own take is that the United States is in profound crisis. That's not a very hopeful thing. The hopeful thing is that there's many mobilizations to try to deal with that crisis in ways that I think would remedy injustices that do exist and have existed for a long time. One can look at Black Lives Matter, one could look at the Me Too movement, Occupy, and one can look across the world too at at very similar movements, Indignados in Spain, giving birth to a new Spanish political party. So I think those are the signs of hope, it seems to me, that people recognize that there is a crisis, and people recognize that we've been told that neoliberalism or that corporate leadership can get us out of the crisis, but in fact that's gotten us into the crisis.
Well, thankfully we have these options and these opportunities to recognize and identify where a great number of possibilities are sitting in front of us, making use of the media and the new media tools, and seeing what happens with social movements more generally. So thank you very much, Kevin, for your contribution. And that's all from us and from me, from Marcus Breen and Boston Media Theory. And until next time, keep on mediating.
This is why you get by on 4 hours sleep. Why you took a second job. This is why you taught yourself how to fix the plumbing and spend hours juggling the bills. This is why you'll do whatever it takes to keep your home. And that is why we want to help. We are making home affordable, a free government resource that can make paying the mortgage easier. Now more options are available. Call 888-995-HOPE to talk one-on-one with a housing expert today.